Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rabbi. And on behalf of my colleagues, thank you all for joining us. This will be our first session of what I'm sure will be an interesting series over the coming months. This time around, we're having a panel where we have issues which we believe are of concern and are worthwhile conversation. In ensuing sessions, as in the past, we'll have a mix of panel conversations and also have visiting guest experts drawn from Canada, the United States, Europe, Israel, and perhaps elsewhere. So for this opening panel, this opening session, let me just take a moment to offer a brief review and set out a couple of observations and questions. We began the Israel dialogues in April of 2021 as tensions built around proposed dislocation of Palestinian families from their Sheikh Jarrah homes, then exacerbated by rumors of Israeli intent on the Temple Mount. By May, a 10-day Gaza war erupted when Hamas, supported by Islamic Jihad, sent rockets, and then Israel responded. There also then was turmoil in mixed towns and cities in Israel. Other than the domestic unrest, this short-term violence was viewed as part of the normal cycle of tit-for-tat behavior between antagonists. It was not indicative of any basic change in the status quo, although it did awaken some to the sectarian tensions within Israel. It was just one more hostile exchange between adversaries. Both sides were keenly aware that any policies or actions affecting Jerusalem and holy sites could be used to incite in pursuit of political interests. The outcome was further entrenchment of perceived irreconcilable goals. The Israel dialogues covered all that and much more, delving into regional and international affairs, Israeli domestic issues around politics, economics, and society, as well as a range of matters pertaining to diaspora relations with Israel and to the meaning of Zionism and the reemergence of anti-Semitism. During the ensuing 3 years, positions have hardened and polarized, both between Israeli and Palestinian peoples and within each respective community. At the same time, the Jewish diaspora, along with others who support Israel, have fractured, while the Palestinian communities and supporters seem to have consolidated. There was a glimmer of something new occurring within Israel when Mansour Abbas and his party joined the short-lived coalition government of Bennett and Lapid. But that changed with the elections that returned Netanyahu to power through the construction of what is widely agreed to be the most right-wing government in Israel's history, one that includes extremist parties and convicted racists. There was a parallel sense of the emergence of new regional relations, sometimes referred optimistically as normalization, with diplomatic efforts by the United States and Saudi Arabia to forge a new set of relations across the region, cautiously opening doors to deeper Israeli involvement. How widely, deeply, and accurately that reflected Israeli beliefs and attitudes and preferences was not clear. It is even less clear now. The initial focus of that government was its legislative initiative on judicial reform, what others labeled as a judicial coup. We all can recall the opposition mounted within the Knesset and more significantly on the streets to prevent such a profound challenge to Israeli democracy and the rule of law. And then came October 7th, with its shocking death, destruction, and capture of 251 hostages, along with an abiding crisis of confidence in the Israeli government, its civil capacity, and trust in the IDF. Yet by November 30th, the negotiated short-term ceasefire resulted in a prisoner exchange for 105 hostages, with 5 more hostages released, and eventually the IDF rescue of 8. 101 hostages remain, and Israel estimates that at least 35 are dead, including, of course, those recently executed in a Hamas tunnel. There was a sense of guarded optimism with the release of the 101. Surely one limited ceasefire having positive results for both sides to the war could lead to a repeat performance, so it was thought. What went wrong? When we look back, why have negotiations and diplomacy failed in pursuit of ceasefires that would come with hostages being released? Why did the dramatic increase in the delivery of humanitarian aid not occur with a concomitant reduction in civilian casualties in Gaza and further release of hostages? Why has there not been a new ceasefire? Why have the Americans, along with other Western allies, as well as the Saudis, Jordanians, Egyptians, and Qataris, been unable to bring this about? There are a variety of possible explanations, and we might not know with any certainty until after the war ends. Information and veracity is one of the costs of war. Let me pose the radical and consequentially unpleasant assertion one occasionally finds offered by both Israeli and American analysts. Neither the Netanyahu government nor Sinwar's Hamas wants this war to end anytime soon. There are two hypotheses. Let me address the first. The increase in humanitarian aid when Hamas effectively controls its allocation and distribution, ironically and tragically, empowers Hamas and has undermined any momentum for Hamas to negotiate a ceasefire. It is not concerned about the consequential suffering of the Gaza citizens, nor has it any reason to release hostages who are there to protect Sinwar and others. Its prolonging of the war feeds into growing anti-Israel sympathies, empowers Islamists, shames Arab leaders, leads to new Hamas strength in the West Bank and Jordan, and exhausts Israel while undermining the United States, the EU, and the Saudis. A second hypothesis: so long as humanitarian aid flows, Israel can claim it is abiding by international humanitarian law. Its goal continues to be destruction of Hamas, but without specifying either what that means, when we know it has happened, or what then is to occur in Gaza. Aside from Netanyahu's legal concerns, his goal reaches beyond Hamas and Gaza in terms of defining the new Israel. And he must reestablish confidence in Israel's overwhelming military presence to reassert deterrence and to re-engage the Saudis from a position of strength. Hostages become collateral damage in this process, especially now under the Hamas policy of killing hostages rather than letting the IDF rescue them. Over the coming months, we will address a full range of issues and ideas relevant to our interests and concerns about Israel. But for now, given the overwhelming impact of the still unfolding Israel-Gaza war and the protracted Israel-Palestinian conflict that may lead to an escalation with Hezbollah in the north and Islamists on the West Bank, we thought it appropriate to open with this focus. So the first very general question to the panel: where is Israel headed in the near term in this protracted war with Gaza? What are its realistic and practical options? Is there a way out? Are there realistic exit strategies? And at what costs and to whom? So let me leave it there. I invite my panelists, colleagues, to take it in any direction they wish. And I encourage all of you to offer questions or comments through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So folks, over to you.
All right, I'll jump in, David.
Thank you.
And again, I'll apologize because I may turn my camera off, on and off, because I'm trying to eat some soup because I'm home with the flu. Um, I, I guess from where I sit, one of the interesting or uncomfortable facts that's there now is that I don't think that Netanyahu or Sinwar have the right incentives to stop the conflict. I don't think that either of them is well served by stopping the conflict. And I think for Sinwar, there's a sense that, well, you've heard rumors of him getting, evacuated and being able to go somewhere into the diaspora in exchange for hostages coming back, maybe. But I mean, if you look at Sinwar's original commentary on what Hamas should do and be, this is very much in line with it. This is taking them back to their roots. This is placing them sort of in the center of jihad. And although I think most of us, or all of us, look at it as abhorrent to view the deaths of civilians in Gaza as a victory for Sinwar. I mean, this is the game that they're playing. These are wins for them. And they view it as a price that needs to be paid in order to delegitimize Israel, to further weaken Israel in terms of its relationships with the world, to further weaken Israel in terms of its economy, and to try to spur a multi-front war, including all of the partners that are around Israel into action, to push for arms embargoes from Israel's key partners. And I would say, in effect, they're winning that war. And we just saw, the extension or doubling down of an arms embargo from Canada. The Americans have continued to ship all sorts of arms to them, but still with some caveats around it. The British, who have always been more steadfast in their sort of military support of Israel than we have, and our more important partners have started to place limitations on it. You can read articles in the Israeli press. I was just reading this morning in either Ynet or the Times of Israel, the fact that in the high-tech world in Israel, investment is down across the board, and folks are worried about the future of it, and some companies are thinking of going abroad. So I think that's a challenge. On the Netanyahu side, I mean, I think, well, I don't know if I buy the Netanyahu is entirely callous and wants a war to continue only for his own political interests. I think there are elements of that are in there, and I think we need to be able to pull those out and distinguish them from the other real concerns that Israel might have, for example, around maintaining control of the Philadelphia corridor, and I think in the big picture, not winding up straight back to where we were on October 6th in the aftermath of all of this. And lastly, the other observation I'd make is we asked the question, or you did, David, about why can the Americans not manage to get a ceasefire? I really think at the moments when a ceasefire has looked most promising, the Americans have done loads to undermine a ceasefire by talking publicly in ways that make it almost impossible for either of the parties to do what they need to do domestically. And they're doing that for their own domestic politics. But I think it's been massively harmful to what's been going on the ground. And I think in that sense, Blinken and co need to realize that the stakes are a bit bigger. Maybe they will now that Biden's not the candidate. So those are my first thoughts.
Terrific. Thank you. John, get your hand up.
Thank you. So I would just add to your very comprehensive list, David, a couple of other issues that did come up in the course of the last few years, but more recently, we, of course, had some assassination efforts by Israel, one in April, which led to the first ever attack by Iran on Israel, which then led, surprisingly in some cases, but not in others, to a whole host of Israeli allies coming to its defense, including Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and of course the United States and the UK. We then had other assassinations, which many thought could lead to a regional war, which thankfully that has not happened for a variety of reasons. Probably most likely because neither Iran nor Hezbollah wants to get into a major war with Israel and the United States at this point, and because the United States has provided massive military effort in the region, sending signals to Iran and Hezbollah that they're probably hearing well. I would just agree in part with Dylan. Aaron David Miller, who has been on our panel a couple of times, has essentially said that we don't have a ceasefire because neither Sinwar nor Bibi have any urgency to agree on one. I think Dylan's analysis of Sinwar is very accurate. He feels, for a whole variety of reasons, that he's got Israel exactly where he wants. Mm-hmm. He's got anti-Semitism rampant in the diaspora. He's got Israel being declared a pariah. He has polarization within Israel and in the diaspora. And he's essentially ended the regional normalization that the Saudis and Israel and the United States were attempting, etc. So as far as he's concerned, and I agree with Dylan, he obviously has little concern, for the people of Gaza, because he could have stopped the killing any time he wished. On Bibi, I would tend to disagree a bit. I think you have a situation where his Minister of Defense, his Chief of Staff, the head of Mossad, and the head of the Shin Bet have all said that the Philadelphia corridor and Netzarim corridors do not have to be protected at this time, and there could be a ceasefire if they wanted. They could always go back in if necessary. We're not talking about leaving the Rafah crossing open for 5 years, and we're not talking about Bibi allowing millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to flow to Hamas to be able to bring in arms and rockets, etc. I do think that Bibi is concerned about if he were to agree to a ceasefire, that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich might leave the coalition, and therefore an election would likely happen. And according to the polls right now, the opposition would win in 70 plus seats, and the current coalition would be at about 49 seats, which means that Bibi would be out of a job and really facing his trial, which has essentially been postponed up until now. You would think that given the hostage situation, given what we've seen where it's been clearly established that negotiation releases hostages, not more war, that Bibi and his cabinet would realize that a ceasefire is the way to get the hostages released, if that's your priority. And clearly, everybody in that cabinet, except the Minister of Defense, seem to be supporting Bibi. I guess the other thing I would just say is the opposition has been trying desperately to convince 5 members, 5 MKs, to withdraw from the coalition so we could move to a different situation in Israel. And so far, that has been impossible. Reminds me a lot of the Republican Party in the United States. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Derek.
That's helpful. We've been talking about leadership and how much that does or does not matter as a factor, but I want to give a good example, because if you look at the public opinion poll that, David, that you sent around a little while ago, at first it looks pretty grim in that substantial majorities of Israelis and Palestinians expect the war to continue. They expect it to spread to the West Bank. They expect it to become a regional war. That is, there's a kind of a grim fatalism. But then if you look at a different set of questions, if there were a regional arrangement, would you rather have an all-out war, or would you rather have a regional peace arrangement? Not surprisingly, most people want to see that regional peace arrangement. That is, there's a sense on the one hand of gloom and doom, but there also is a lot of plasticity or flexibility if there were to be true leadership on both the international and the regional level. And this buttresses a point that Dalia Scheindlin made in a column some months ago, that public opinion in the Middle East, like anywhere else, is really quite flexible. And if you have strong leadership, you can overcome it. Another good example of this has to do with the ongoing polling about what kind of two-state, one-state scenarios people in the region favor. So if you talk to Palestinians, support for the two-state option has actually increased since October 7th, which is interesting. And what you get is about 2/3 of Palestinians, West Bank Palestinians, either favor the two-state option, about 40%, or about 25% favor a single state, the state of all of its citizens. So it's not a Zionist state, it's not a Jewish state as we know it, but it's a state where everyone is equal. So that's about 2/3 of Palestinians in the West Bank do believe that Jews have a right to be treated as equals. The other third don't. The other third would rather see some sort of state in which Jews do not have the same rights as Palestinians. If you look at the Jewish side right now, it's much more grim. Over 40% of Israeli Jews right now would like to see the West Bank annexed and without equal rights for Palestinians. Only about 14% favor the kind of idealistic one state of all of its citizens ideal. Maybe 25% favor two states. So at the moment, ironically, in the middle of this horrific war, when scores of thousands of Palestinians have died, there's actually more support among Palestinians for some kind of equitable relationship with Israel than among Israeli Jews. That's at this moment. And again, it can change on a dime. Public opinion is extremely volatile, which gets back to the issue of leadership, and that we don't have. We certainly don't have it among the Palestinians. The Palestine Authority in Ramallah is effectively non-functional. We do not have it in the state of Israel. And there is defective leadership in the international community outside of the region. I can only hope that that will change. It may change in November with the presidential election in the United States. We can talk about the circumstances under which the Israeli government could change, but without that kind of change at the very top, nothing's going to move forward.
Mark, did you want to, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate or emphasize what Derek just said in his last comment, that it's always, in my view, a question of leadership, and that in the Middle East, in Israel and in the Palestinian community, there's a dearth of visionary, effective leadership. That's been the case for many years now. We see that also in the Western world, in my view, as well, in terms of leadership. Political leadership. And I think many of us have been feeling and thinking that nothing positive is going to change in Israel until there's a new government, a change of government. And some of us have already commented here today about the constraints and the challenges of bringing that about. And it sort of puzzles me as to why Gallant is not, and others are not able to convince 4 or 5 other members of the Likud party to sort of bolt and see the light. And to me, that's the only hope right now for an earlier election or an earlier change of government, and not have to wait until the scheduled elections over a year from now.
John?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk briefly about the mood in Israel. I have a sister that lives in the north, and she attends these protests. And so, it is we've all heard this, I know, and for some it's not new, but for most Israelis, they are still on October 7th. They are still fearful. They are still in despair. I'm not sure if that element of revenge is even there anymore. They are so concerned about the hostages and about the soldiers that are dying every day still. And there are the 60,000 that are evacuated from the north and are getting very little support from the government, while it still provides its $500 million to the Haredim. And so at the same time that they're feeling this despair and concern, and especially following the 6 hostages that were executed, they don't have a government to turn to. Now, when I say they, I'm talking about those Israelis who don't support Bibi and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. But there are many, many Israelis, as we've seen from the most recent protests, who want an end to the war. They don't want an end to the war because they don't want Hamas to be destroyed. They want an end to the war because they want those hostages released. And so they're protesting. And so in addition to the despair, they are feeling helpless because they have leadership which they don't trust, don't believe in, and desperately, want to change. And I think they're feeling the same frustration we are. How do you get a change when the next election is scheduled for the end of 2026? Just kind of leave it at that.
Derek.
So I want to
Yeah.
turn the discussion a little bit more to something, John, you were saying about the mood in Israel. In Israel, they're fighting a different war than the war we're seeing in the rest of the world. That is, if you watch Israeli television or you read, online from Israeli news outlets, it's a different war in that the focus is on the hostages, on the soldiers who are being killed and wounded on almost a daily basis. It's the ongoing trauma of October 7th. That's the war that Israel is fighting. And it's not the war that we're seeing, everywhere else in the world, where there's more of an emphasis on Gaza and what's happening in Gaza, because Israelis are seeing very little on their television screens about what's happening in Gaza, especially on Channel 14, which is the Israeli equivalent of Fox News, but even also on Channel 12 and 13. So they are seeing a different war, but that leads to a big question, which is, how do any of us know what's happening in Gaza? This is something I was raising with the group this morning. There are no journalists in Gaza really reporting on the war. And so none of us really knows what's going on. And what's happening is all of us around the world are latching onto whatever kind of news reporting we find politically or emotionally congenial. So, for example, if we're going to listen to the IDF spokesperson's office, we're going to get a certain version of the war. Now, I can't think of a country in the history of the modern world whose military spokespeople have given honest accounts of a war. I'm not singling Israel out. I'm just talking about countries in general. So we have here in Boston for the year, or in Cambridge, an Israeli journalist. He heads up the Gaza assignment team for Haaretz. And they're all working from outside of Gaza, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. So there's hundreds of people on the ground in Gaza with cell phones. Well over 100 journalists have been killed in Gaza. So Palestinian journalists have been killed in Gaza since things began. But they've got their cell phones. They're taking images. They're sending stuff back to Israel and around the world. But they're getting fragmentary information. And then they have to confirm it. And they have to get multiple confirmations. The result being that everyone is telling a kind of fragmented story. There are the aid agencies. There's the United Nations itself. Or there's the Gaza Health Ministry, which provides figures, statistics, which are then viewed with skepticism by people who support Israel. We have to rely on satellite imagery, which has remarkable resolution. So this journalist showed me on his phone an image taken from a satellite showing the IDF building a military base in the Netzarim corridor, this sort of thing. So just before we get too deep into thinking about how this war is affecting Jewish communities or the possibilities for the future, what's actually happening in Gaza. We just all have to realize how uncertain any of the information we are getting about the war is. I mean, we know when hostages have been killed. We know when Israeli soldiers are killed. The bodies are, we know that. We know there's been massive destruction in Gaza from film photography, but there's so much we don't know. There's never been anything like it really in the last several decades. And I think it just gives us a little pause.
Let me just add to that observation. 2 days ago, I was in a long conversation with one of the leading academic analysts in Israel, who has deep connections with government, in particular with the security defense side. And he said basically exactly what you just mentioned, Derek. He said he just doesn't know. He doesn't know what are the facts. The access to information that is confirmed and that you are assured of in terms of its accuracy, its validity, is simply not there right now. And it troubles him and others deeply in terms of being able to better understand not only what is happening, but what the options are. So when you try and game this out, you're not necessarily doing it blind, but you're doing it with incomplete and quite possibly inaccurate information. It's
Just
ironic, given that this is the age of information penetration. So, John.
also, anecdotally, in a way, I regularly listen to a podcast called Unholy, two Jews talking about the news. One is the lead anchor on Channel 12, a woman, and the other is Jonathan Friedland from The Guardian. And they had Amos Harel on yesterday, who is, I think, considered, he writes for Haaretz, but he's considered one of the primary military journalists, and definitely has the ear of the IDF, etc. He was saying, by way of quote, what he understands the situation to be, that about 15,000 Hamas militants have been killed. And he was saying that in his view, Hamas is sort of no longer, and now that's 15,000 out of about 40,000. But when you add in the tunnels that have been destroyed, the leadership that's been destroyed, his view, and I'm just offering his view, is that we're now down to Hamas as an insurgency, as opposed to a full army, and that they will continue to attack Israeli soldiers and kill them as they can and protect their hostages, etc. He did not disagree with the total numbers of 41,000 minus the 15,000, but he also thinks, as many have said, there are many more Palestinians dead under the rubble and uncounted in Gaza. Yeah, I agree 100% with what Derek said. Israelis don't see what's going on. They could. I mean, my sister reads the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you can get the BBC. They don't want to see it. They don't. And they're incapable of devoting their hearts to people in Gaza, whether or not they're innocent or not, and Israelis don't get into that much, when they are grieving what's going on in their own country. So that's a reality, and it's probably not helping the future ability to find a peaceful way out of this. But we just have to accept that and understand it.
Just a housekeeping note before I turn to Dylan. Someone has sent something into the Q&A, as I requested. The Q&A doesn't seem to be functioning properly. So it must be the chat.
Oh, no, it's
I-
okay. David, I can read the question to you if you'd
Oh,
like. I can
um,
see it. I'm sorry you can't.
Okay, but I'm not sure this is the right time, just depending on what the question is about.
It's about some of the points that both John and Derek have made about the limited information that Israelis
Sure.
have during the
So
war.
why don't you, yeah, if you don't mind doing that, Sam,
Of course.
and then I'll turn to Dylan and others to respond.
Absolutely. So the question is, it's not really a question, it's a statement, but there is a question in this, which is, do Israelis really not have access to global media? They don't have access to CNN, they don't have access to Fox, they don't have access to the BBC or anything like that. Are you underestimating? I'm going to put in the phrasing of a question rather than a statement. Are you underestimating the information that is available to Israelis on a global level?
I mean, I'll take that because it was going to be one of my points too. I think that's about right. Everybody I know in Israel and from my time spent in Israel, I mean, the BBC International's there as one of the normal channels. So I think that they do get that. I suspect though that like a lot of folks these days, you know, people tailor what they're viewing to not offend them too much in some cases. I don't think we're always great at looking at all sides of an issue. And I'll admit myself, I mean, I'm a person who follows this very closely and ordinarily pays attention to Al Jazeera. And at some point, I just stopped watching Al Jazeera or reading it because I found it too stressful. So I think that may be a little bit of the explanation of what's going on there. I will say, I mean, I was there at the beginning of the summer in Israel. You do have a sense that there's a less palpable understanding, or that people just don't care about the level of global isolation that Israel's experiencing and are less alarmed by it, frankly, than I am. Because I think it sure looks pretty bleak when you look at, you know, the degradation of bilateral relations in Israel's place in the world moving forward. So I think it's a good question. I mean, I don't know, Derek and John may want to chime in with further comment if they want to on it.
Well,
I'll just say very quickly, in a time of national emergency, people do seek comfort. And sure, they can get CNN and they can get all kinds of things. But at least what I'm being told by my Israeli friends and colleagues is people are just, they're going to the Israeli news. It's what they want to hear. It just reminds me of many decades ago, Israel had radio and no television, and it was state monopoly. And people had access to the BBC World Service. But I talked to older Israelis who said, but we knew that the Israeli government radio was not telling us the whole truth, but we wanted to listen to it, right? We wanted to. And, you know, if you want to get caught up on what's happening in the war in Israel, you're much more likely to turn on the Israeli news than to listen to the BBC. Of course, there are people who do. Absolutely. It's not a question of what's available. It's a question of what you choose. Right? And this gets back to this question of the mood in Israel that we've been talking about. Can I
Oh, sorry.
want to raise an issue just to throw out there and then turn everything over to other people, which is we've been talking about like where things could go moving forward. And I want to put on my historian's hat just for a second to use history to try to predict the future, which is after 67, there was a lot of euphoria in the country about the conquest or the liberation of the territories. And there were gradual moves to settle them, and it was done kind of piecemeal and very slowly. It was done in a much less traumatic or much less traumatized environment than we have now. It was not the same. But there's certainly a lot of signs right now of a desire by a substantial minority in Israel to settle Gaza, to use this crisis, this great war, as an opportunity for basically addressing the wrongs of 2005, as they see it, the Gaza withdrawal. And it could be done with very small things, army bases. Someone was saying the other day, synagogues, and then you have to have maybe a military base to protect the synagogue, and then a yeshiva, and then, or maybe it's a synagogue and they spend the night, and then they spend more nights, and that kind of gradual process. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but there are definitely people in Israel who want it to happen, which gets back to the point about insurgency that you raised, John, about it's no longer an army, it's an insurgency. But imagine a situation where Israel is occupying Gaza for the long run, where there are Jews once again living there, and where there is an ongoing insurgency. Now, this is a totally possible scenario, not the only one, but it's, we want to throw out some possible futures, and this is one of them.
Yeah, the
Mark-
notion. Sorry, John.
Mark, trying to get in there at one point. Did you want to follow up?
Well, I'm just, yeah, I did, but I think the question of what's going to happen in Gaza is so uncertain right now, but from the little that we do know, I think it's a very minority position now in terms of Israel moving back into Gaza in any kind of significant way going into the future. That may change, but from what I've read and all the people that I speak to, I don't think there's a really strong sentiment among Israelis that they should re-enter Gaza in any kind of significant way other than what they're doing militarily right now.
Yeah, I would just say in response that I guess I'm less worried about the crazies moving in, although it's a definite possibility, and that's certainly what they like. We saw the convention in which they were ministers of the government, and other MKs were advocating that, etc. I think my larger concern is that if Bibi has his way, according to what he said, he wants to either be in parts of Gaza or be outside and ready to go in whenever he has to. And if that happens, there will never be a multinational force that is prepared to go in there and to begin to try and establish rule of law and begin to deliver humanitarian assistance and do infrastructure rebuilding, et cetera, which is going to take billions and billions of dollars and years. So I think the real concern, and Dylan, we heard this at Ditchley, is that you're going to end up with a Somalia situation, no rule of law, gangs sort of controlling the place, Hamas insurgents, Israel going in when it needs to. And I don't know what's going to happen with the 2 million people that live there. But they're certainly not going to Egypt, as people keep saying, well, why doesn't Egypt just let them in? Well, they're not going to Egypt. And so I think that's what we have to fear. And that's not going to be great for Israel's reputation. And it's going to be horrible for the Palestinian people there. And it's not going to be good for, those that want to see peace going forward. So I really hope that that idea that Israel is just going to, control the situation from the outside, whatever happens inside, passes from the scene at some point.
Dylan?
Thanks. Just to carry on what John's saying, I don't think Israel's unique in what they've done here. And I know that, the Americans have kind of said, learn the lessons that we learned ourselves in Iraq. But and they're talking about the specifics of urban warfare and, and so on. But I think the biggest lesson that Israel can learn from the American mistakes in Iraq is that you need to define what a war's goals are. You need to have a theory of what success looks like. They've never defined it. And as a result, it's hard to see when you get to the point that it's not just about, well, then they can wrap up and go home. I think it's also, it becomes harder for the rest of the world to see what they're trying to do there. It becomes easier to project, probably for supporters of Israel, the best intentions onto what Israel's doing, but for detractors of Israel or even dispassionate, third-party observers, things that are pretty difficult. And I think beyond that, it's really shocking to see that. I mean, they had intelligence that something might have come out of Gaza, whether that was viewed as entirely credible or not. But they had no plan for if something like this did happen. And I'm not sure, it seems, that they have a plan for what they're supposed to be doing in the north. I'm not sure that they have a plan for what they're supposed to be doing with Iran. And those are all super difficult issues. But I do think on a whether or not people are conscious of it in Israel, it's not just the lack of certainty, it's the clear lack of a plan that must make people fairly depressed. I mean, they're just kind of rolling along with wherever the river takes them. And I think, again, it goes back to, if you don't know where you stand, if you don't know what you're trying to do in this kind of a conflict, and the other side does, and I think Sinwar knows exactly what he's trying to do, you can be pulled into exactly what they want you to do. And I think that's the big danger for Israel.
Which goes to the question of leadership.
Rabbi Kay, welcome. You have your hand up, please.
Yes. So I'll just respond for myself briefly, saying that I think it's a fair thing to question whether or not intention is here on either the part of Sinwar or Netanyahu, when there's a distinct possibility that this has simply gotten away from both of them. There were several think pieces and articles that I read, many of which you all shared with me, in the days after October 7th, which questioned whether or not Sinwar expected the effectiveness of October 7th, and that whether the dog had caught the car, as it were, and now didn't know what to do now that they had latched onto the bumper. And similarly, that as much as Netanyahu may know he needs to hold on for dear life in order to maintain both his power and his ability not to go to jail on corruption charges, that he may not actually know how to get out of this situation and is simply running behind the car as well at this point. Just my own lack of faith in either one. And then I will just share the follow-up question that came into the Q&A, which I think is an interesting one, which is, again, on the subject of the Israeli psyche, which is, as Canadians, as Americans, as Western observers, no matter how invested we are in Israel, we are not the firsthand people engaging in this. And so how much empathy and how much emotional room for concern is there when you're engaged in war, and when your siblings, your children, your spouses are going off to Miluim, are going off to active service, in order to engage with some of these multiplicities of perspectives? Like, Dylan mentioned turning off Al Jazeera. Do we really anticipate that Israelis who are sending their children off are supposed to watch Al Jazeera and hold a place of contemplative compassion? And why? Why do we anticipate that might be an expectation we have of them? Certainly, it's an anticipation we may have over us as diaspora people invested in this moment, but why on them? That's the question coming from the Q&A. I'll pass it over to Professor Penzler.
That's a fair question. I think it actually relates to your earlier comment that, again, from what we know about Sinwar, it seems that he was had the more extreme views of the Hamas leadership, and did indeed want to set off the beginning of a kind of a apocalyptic struggle. And so this may very well be conforming with what he wanted. With Netanyahu, we have to remember that the coalition guidelines of this government, formed in 2022, proclaim clearly that the government of Israel claims sovereignty over the entirety of Eretz Israel. It's the first time in Israel's history that a government has explicitly claimed a desire or the right to annex the entire land of Israel. There have been other ways to talk about this in the past. I know that the kind of people we talk to in Israel, the academics at Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, the nice high-tech people who live in the major cities or whatever, are not likely to be people who favor some of the far right-wing views I was referring to. But there's actually quite a lot of these people. We just don't talk to them a whole lot. And they are very committed. And they've been working for decades within the settlement movement in the West Bank. And they actually have a lot of influence, I think, in the moment in the military. We see what's happening in the West Bank and in Gaza alike, where, again, I could be wrong, but I would not be at all surprised if we see the beginnings of a government-tolerated small-scale settlement movement, which gets back to the question of, should we expect Israelis to feel sympathy or empathy for Palestinians in the middle of a war? No, they're human beings. They behave the way human beings do. But was this war in and of itself, or is this war in and of itself, I don't mean right simply from a moral point of view, but also from a practical point of view, is this what is needed to assure Israel's security or to enhance Israel's security? Is the killing of this many Palestinians going to assure or Israel's security? And my own sense is no. So the issue is not that Israelis are perceiving this the way that they are, it's that they have been so betrayed by their leaders, but that the forces of the Israeli far right are quite a bit stronger than I think we might want to admit. And it's not that people necessarily agree with them, but they're a very committed group. And it often happens in societies, in revolutionary movements or counter-revolutionary movements. You have a leading sector of very committed people with more extreme views. They are not indicative of society as a whole, but they're nonetheless quite influential.
Dylan.
I guess to respond both to what Derek and Mark discussed about Gaza, but also the question of sympathy amongst Israelis. On the Gaza piece, what I would say is I think it's a relatively small group. I mean, you can look at the people who vote for, what's now religious Zionism, and who used to vote for the religious nationalist movement is 10 to 15% of the population. I think what we've seen since the end of the Second Intifada has been, I think Derek said it, the government tolerating this kind of activity. And I think if you look at the Judaization attempts inside East Jerusalem, right? What went on in Sheikh Jarrah, not the legal title stuff, which is its own issue, but sort of the house-to-house stuff, the slow politicization of moving of conflict into the center of Jerusalem, where it strangely, even though it's the heart of the conflict, didn't feel like the heart of the conflict, is because of the toleration of those hard right elements, mostly by the Netanyahu government. And again, I don't think it's the act of encouragement all the time. I don't think that it's that it's necessarily state sanctioned, but it's the sense that it's also not something people are going to be punished for that's going to be stopped. That's a problem. And I think from my own time in Israel and conversations with Israelis, my worry is, and again, I'm not saying that it's completely likely that you're going to see this stuff spring up in Gaza, but that also with settler violence inside the West Bank that's just exploding, and in some cases is being dealt with by the Israeli authorities, but often not in the way that I think most of us would think that it should. You have an attitude amongst the general Israeli population that it's us or them. And while they may not really be supportive of the expansion of settlements, they just may not be opposed enough to say or do anything. And I think that's what we've seen, and probably this is an exacerbation of it. in terms of the question of whether Israelis should be watching Al Jazeera, again, I only use the example of myself. I don't think Israelis watched Al Jazeera ever, but I think even for Israelis watching the BBC or CNN, I agree with Derek that people look for comfort in these times, and I also think when we look at what's going on in the streets of Toronto and Montreal and other places in the diaspora, I draw a bit of a distinction between Palestinians and non-Palestinians, because I can have a more empathetic approach to Palestinians whose family members are living in the devastation and so on in Gaza, that we all know is taking place, compared to everybody else. And even when they use very heated rhetoric, et cetera. Again, it's not that I accept it as fact or that I think that it's positive, but I guess I just can empathize with it. And I think that's the case on both sides. And I think for governments like the United States and others, it should influence the policy that tries to bring about an end to conflict, because sometimes when people are right in the middle of the line of fire, it's harder to take off those blinders.
Yeah, very thoughtful. John?
I would say, just in response, Dylan, that my take is slightly different. The last time that Bibi Netanyahu spoke in favor of a two-state solution, I was in the room. It was 2009 at Bar Ilan University. He had a couple of extra conditions to it. Since then, as we know, I think he has done everything possible to convince the Israeli people, and this goes back to the leadership question, that there is no partner for peace. He has, as we know, and as I've said, supported Hamas and denigrated the PA, which has provided Israeli security cooperation from the Oslo Accords on, and has suffered terribly in terms of its approval ratings because it's seen as collaborating with Israel. He at the last General Assembly, he held up a map which went from the river to the sea. You know what the river to the sea means on campus. Well, he holds up maps, and he did it a week ago when he was showing why he had to be in the Philadelphia corridor, a map from the river to the sea. And indeed, the textbooks in Israel do not show the green line. Leadership would suggest that you would say, okay, bad governance in the PA, Hamas in Gaza. Let's tell the Palestinians that if they get their act together, we're prepared to get our act together, and we'll work with you, as Yair Lapid said. But Bibi's view, as I think, is he's made it completely clear he does not support two states. He does not support the PA going into Gaza. He does not support a reform of the PA. He withholds taxes from them, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's the government of the last 17 years looking the other way. I think if Donald Trump had allowed annexation, he would have gone for it. It was Donald Trump and Jared Kushner that stopped the annexation, frankly, when the Abraham Accords were signed. So I do think we need new leadership that's prepared to hold out its hand without naivete and with Israel's security concerns at the fore.
So in my opening remarks, I connected Netanyahu with what I said, his vision of a new state. What is the new Israel? We can unpack that in terms of the inevitability of the escalation of violence in Gaza and whether that was simply an inevitably would lead to October 7th or something similar. Similarly, the inevitability of the increase of violence in the West Bank, both violence started by settlers and violence undertaken by Palestinians, either aligned with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, or others. But let me turn it to all of you in a different way. Talking about leadership. If you were in that position, new government, what's the blueprint for moving forward? What is the blueprint for addressing the new realities on the ground in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Israel? The shifting of public opinion, the absence of leadership, the conflicting organizations, some quite militant on all sides. What steps would you take, assuming you had a coalition government that would support you? What are realistic steps for those of us who still believe in the possibility of a democratic, never mind a liberal democratic state of Israel? Where's the leadership? If you're the leader, what are the steps? Mark.
So we haven't talked about the North, and we haven't talked about the border with Lebanon. And I think
they were referred to, but we didn't talk about it.
We didn't talk in depth about it. But I think new leadership in Israel has to be in place and in a context where the majority of Israelis are going to trust their political leaders. And many of the Israelis need to see that their government and its various agencies, including the IDF, are going to be able to provide the security for their lives going forward. And that they're going to have to be able to provide security along the Gaza periphery so that the residents of the various kibbutzim and settlements in the periphery can, if they choose, return to those settlements and to those kibbutzim. And the same for the North. They need to be able to secure the northern border with Lebanon so that the thousands and thousands of Israelis who have had to abandon their places of residence are going to be able to move back. And I think Israelis, even in the center and in the other parts of the country, are going to want to know that Israelis, wherever they live, can live in peace and security throughout the country. And so one of the first pieces from my perspective would be that new political leadership has to be able to secure that. And that's going to take resources and effort, and it's going to take some military activities as well in order to secure that and make sure it doesn't happen again. If from what we know about what happened on October 7th, if the IDF had been in much greater numbers and full force along the Gaza periphery, things might have been very different on October 7th.
So before I turn to Derek, I've got to respond, if you don't mind. Over the last 30 years, there's been a considerable academic industry allied with both people in foreign affairs and in defense on something called confidence and security building measures. Been very important in terms of creating that trust and that sense of security among people who have otherwise felt insecure, and doing it in a very practical way. Indeed, over 30 years ago, Gabi Ben-Dor and I edited a book where lots of people wrote about from within the Middle East on just that. So the point really here is that for CSBMs to work, you need partners. It's not a unilateral process. So the extent to which you're talking about trust and confidence in the security of your government to protect you isn't very effective if it's unilateral. It's a step, but it's incomplete.
Well, I'm talking about first steps.
Yeah, but it doesn't go very far on its own.
You're not going to get to the second steps that you're talking about from your book that you did with Gabby many years ago.
No,
unless you
but
get
what
that
I
first
am talking about is you need to, or others need to be partnered in this so that you nurture responsible, similar kinds of activities on the other side.
Okay.
Derek?
Well, I'd throw out something from my more politically savvy friends, that you can't have an effective security policy if you don't have a stable domestic society. And Israel doesn't have a stable domestic society. It's been simmering on the verge of a civil war. It was on the verge of a civil war on October 6th, 2023. If Israel's not at war, if it just has its normal military needs, it does not need Haredi soldiers. Haredi soldiers, I understand there's a symbolic power to the idea of the Haredi draft, but I'm wondering if that future coalition that we need, that moderate centrist coalition, could incorporate Haredi parties. It really needs them, and one way to buy them off, frankly, is to go easy on the conscription of Haredi soldiers. There will be some, increasingly, by the way, over time, who will want to serve. It's already beginning, right?
Yeah.
You have the Netzach Yehuda battalion, and the numbers have been growing of themselves. You also have more and more Haredi men in the workforce. There's a kind of normalization. You don't have to force it. And if that would get you a stronger coalition, I think it's worth it.
If I may just interject, and there could also be alternate civilian service for the Haredi.
Yeah, which is what's happening now with a lot of Haredim are volunteering for civilian service. I'm just saying that there is a kind of fetishization of the notion of the Haredi being drafted precisely because it is so difficult for those Israelis who are drafted and who serve in combat roles. But
part of the problem, though, Derek, is it's not just the serving; it's the money that's going to the Haredim, and the taxes that are being paid by the people who make the money and who send their children. So there's two elements to it. I agree with you. Let them, and I agree with Mark. Let them do something else. But when you're sending, when your budget should be going to education and health and a lot of other things, and it's going to support these people who aren't serving, it's really gnawing at secular Israelis. So they got to figure out a few things there. But I agree with you. If you want to reduce polarization, that's a good place to start.
It's not perfect. It's expensive. It always has been. The other issue is that the eternal government of Benjamin Netanyahu has thrived on rekindling what was called in Hebrew Hasheda Edati, the ethnic demon, and the distinction between Yisrael Rishonah and Yisrael Shniah, the first and second Israel. So that is the Israel of Ashkenazim and the Israel of Jews of Middle Eastern and North African origin. It's been 50, 60 years since the worst of those tensions, the discrimination against Mizrahi Jews and so on. Things are actually, on a sociological level, improving quite a bit in terms of the communities intermixing and the like. Again, if we want to have an effective government in terms of its decision-making k'lapei chutz, towards the outside, it needs to have a stronger sense of social harmony. So my second issue is to create a very new discourse regarding the relations between the different Jewish communities in Israel, secular and religious on the one hand, as I just said, but also the different sub-ethnicities, because the Netanyahu government has thrived on division and sowing disunity and fear. So I think that's a prerequisite to having a strong government and a strong society, which can then have a strong security policy.
Dylan?
There's a question. I don't know if that's what Rabbi K was going to raise in the Q&A, but
I can't see it.
There's a question in the Q&A that says, panelist keeps on saying there's no leadership, but there is a leadership, but you don't like it. Or essentially, is it a case that, there is a leadership, but you don't like it?
I agree with that question.
Listen, I think the idea that saying there are people who are ostensibly in charge is different than saying, that there's real leadership. And You could make an argument that Netanyahu has actually, and I assume he would, stopped Israel from committing further follies of giving up territory, pulling out in exchange for the idea of peace and the idea they would be able to go back. And then when it comes to actually going back, it's very difficult to do. But I would disagree. I disagree with that, and I think that the challenge for Netanyahu at this point is that I think it's very difficult to show leadership when, whether it's factual or it's just perception, you are in a conflict of interest, and your actions could be read as, serving your own personal interests rather than the interest of what you're supposed to be doing in stewarding the state. And I think that, a prime minister that's facing the legal challenges that they're facing, trying to make changes to laws specifically to deal with those legal challenges, et cetera, make it pretty difficult. And I also think you're right, Fred, that, I think probably most of the people on this panel don't like the concept of firmly walking away from a two-state solution. I think that and I think that, John's right, that Netanyahu has done that, and has intentionally tried to denigrate at least the formula that was there for the last 20 years. I'm not sure that I buy the idea that he has a clear-cut alternative vision, which is all the land from the river to the sea, and we're going to go out and necessarily settle it. I think Netanyahu is a lot more opaque in his goals than that. I think it is just, don't take risks, manage the conflict, and don't give things up unless you really need to. And I think all of us, or at least from just speaking for myself, would say that, notwithstanding the fact that it's very difficult to imagine a two-state solution coming to fruition, it's the only solution that's there, that's viable. It's much better than the alternative. And therefore, I don't buy that there's been great leadership in Israel, even though I do recognize there have been a lot of headwinds and a lot of challenges coming from those who would like to disrupt a path towards a two-state solution.
Rabbi Kay, you've been waiting patiently. Sam.
I'm going to try to answer your question, David, but just in my opinion, there are two major elements of Israeli society that are broken at the moment, that for Israeli society to survive going into the future, it either needs to repair or it needs to adapt. And the first of those things is the nature of Haredi service. That has been a kick the can down the road problem from my understanding, since really the late 60s, early 70s, when the mandate was extended from a few people to the wider element of the population. And that solving that is both a balm for the part of society that provides, like John was talking about, but is also one of those pieces that Israeli society was united in its pain around it, in that you knew it was happening and you were frustrated about it, but it was like a wound that was covered. And now the coverage has been ripped off of it, and it needs to be addressed in some way. The second and more important piece is the recovery of those who are taken in war. The promise of the IDF and the promise of the government is twofold. One is that if you fall in war, we will get you back. And two, we will do absolutely everything in our power to retrieve you if you're taken hostage. And an element of that promise then goes as well to the periphery, where the promise is, if you settle along the borders, we will be there to protect you when inevitably you are endangered and the center of the country is not. And if you were to ask me if there is a single greater pain point at the moment in Israeli society, I don't think I could name it. which is that both of those things have been overturned, that October 7th proved that actually at the borders we are not safe and the IDF is not there in that moment to protect you. And then the follow-up that being, and if you are taken, we cannot, not will not, at least at first it was cannot necessarily save you. And then the destruction of the piece of society that is held is Netanyahu, just a day before the hostages were executed, publicly stating aloud that he was prioritizing military victory over their return and safekeeping. And I do not know if an ongoing government, I don't know if the next government can restore that or not, but either Israeli society needs to adapt to that question of what happens when those promises are not kept and are in fact not just not kept, but are no longer part of the national fabric, or what it takes to restore those two elements of the national promise. Because that's a fundamental element of being Israeli.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
It aligns with what I was, I think, saying as well. In terms of security.
Thanks.
John?
I think that's so important. I would just raise in the list of things that could be addressed and could be very helpful. 21 to 22% of Israelis are Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis. Those Palestinian Israelis, if they voted, would not be voting for Bibi or Ben-Gvir or Smotrich. Having Abbas in that prior coalition was a major breakthrough for Israel. And if the demographics continue the way they are with increased numbers of, let's say, those on the right, it will be extremely important to, and it sounds a bit that we're buying them off, but it will be extremely important to get the Arab Israeli community to vote and to vote in favor of those parties that would actually help them going forward. But in order to do that, they have to obviously have an interest in that, and they have to be welcomed into the Israeli community as they are in the various medical fields and pharmacy and nursing, as we know. But they have to be, you can't have a Bibi Netanyahu saying the Arabs are running to the polls and are going to defeat us, and therefore my Likudnik should come out. Those people can they can be very solid supporters of a more liberal, but of a more center kind of Israel, and they have their problems of crime, and they have their problems of gangs, and they have their problems of loyalty. But if they can be brought on board, and if they can be treated as, eliminate as much discrimination as possible as fast as you can, then they can be real allies. And they can be allies in also making peace with their cousins and their brothers in Gaza and in the West Bank. And if they're treated better, and if the people in the West Bank are treated better, then that's the other, And leadership means that you've got to put the extremists on both sides out of the picture. And that's complicated, but that's what has to happen if you're going to move forward.
Could I just add to that, John, because I think John's point is very important. And I think the proof of your comments, John, is the fact that we look at the response of the Palestinian/Arab Israeli community post-October 7th, compared to how some of that community responded to previous outbursts in Gaza and so on. And I think there is a real potential there, as you've expressed it, because we did not see an outburst of incitement among that community since October 7th.
Dylan?
Thanks. Just talking about the leadership question, again, to the point from Fred or Frida Muskovitz. I think it's easy to say when you step back and look at the big picture, that society should make rational decisions and do what's good for the long term, and so on. And I think, you can look at a similar situation that's going on all across the world right now with climate change. Climate change is coming. We know we need to change things, but in the face of an affordability crisis, in Canada, you even have the New Democratic Party saying they're going to get rid of carbon pricing, et cetera, because people are worried about their day to day. I think the one challenge that's there when we talk about, and I think it's sometimes a flaw of the way that we, from places far away from Israel, sort of view the motivations of ordinary Israelis. They're going to deal with their immediate safety and existential security first. And so real leadership needs to provide that. I also think for the rest of the world, and I don't pretend that Canada has a lot of power in this regard, but for the Americans, the Brits, et cetera, I mean, what's really happened here is the explosion of the Iranian-funded, axis of terror attacking Israel and existentially threatening its ability to live, at least in the way that it had lived before. It's a very small place. You talk about the north's been evacuated and the border with Gaza is no longer viable. And so I think that for the Western world, if you want to see an Israel that's able to move towards a two-state solution, folks are going to have to do more about that. And as much as we like to think that Israel is this massively powerful state, I mean, it's powerful, with conventional military power vis-a-vis its immediate neighbors. But, it's still a small country, and it's going to take a wider coalition to be able to deal with those issues. And I think that you can see this week that, I mean, it's the Iran issue's taken on a whole other dimension with them supplying missiles to the Russians, and how this really figures into a further sort of polarizing world there. And that's a job for Western diplomacy writ large, not only for Israel. But I will just say, to Fred or Frida, I'm not sure from the screen names point, you can't expect from Israelis, what we aren't good at doing ourselves, and in Canada, in terms of always looking at the long term when the short term's not secured.
Hey, we're close to the end of the session. Let me invite each of my good colleagues, if there's a last comment or observation you wish to make. Before you do that, let me just throw out or reach back into one of the opening comments I made about unintended consequences of humanitarian aid. One of the major points of criticism of Israel was its initially what seemed to be slow and then insufficient provision of humanitarian aid, from food and water to medical, or throughout Gaza as the populations moved. And yet more analysis seems to indicate that much of this humanitarian aid has benefited Hamas. It's controlled it. It's gotten wealthy from it. It manages, it helps it manage what is going on in Gaza. And there have been discussions in Israel that this humanitarian aid should be considerably restricted. There's even been reports that there are plans that perhaps the humanitarian aid should be cut off in the northern third of Gaza, where Gazans could then head south, and Israel could focus on asserting its dominance, its presence in the north, and then move forward. Undoubtedly, that would result in further loss of life and in further negative responses from the international community. But it's not an expected response if you see or if you believe that humanitarian aid is being used in ways that has not been intended. So one of the things to consider, where we sitting in the diaspora are justifiably concerned with the death and destruction of civilians, is the extent to which humanitarian aid becomes, again, a tool used for unintended consequences. And what are the options available to Israel to both seen to be and in fact delivering humanitarian aid in a way that gets to those for whom it's intended and does not further strengthen Hamas? One proposal that has been out there for a long time has been bringing in external parties to provide the security. Scandinavians, the Brits, Jordanians, Egyptians. The response from all those places is not interested. That's not what we're going to do. Too dangerous. We'd have to shoot people. So with that sobering question or observation, let me turn to each of you for a final thought, and then to Rabbi Kay to wind it up. John?
First of all, I'd just like to say it's nice that Rabbi Kay has intervened, and I welcome him as a full member of the panel and hope he continues to be, as opposed to just being moderator. Certainly welcomed his thoughts. Secondly, David, I don't know where you're getting your facts about Hamas controlling all this aid. It's certainly, I've not read extensively. I've heard many rumors about Hamas controlling it. I've heard rumors about gangs controlling it. I've also heard experts say that it's actually up to the IDF to ensure that the aid gets through. There was a siege at the beginning, and there were months and months when no aid was getting through. And apparently both from Egypt and from Israel, they're still not getting enough through. So this idea that Hamas is controlling it all and getting rich from it, I'd be interested in where you're getting the information and if it's been validated. But if it is, I accept the questions that follow. And thank you to all my panelists for a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot.
Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to end by saying that this has been a very important and informative discussion about what's been happening and what the current situation is and what the projections are for the future with respect to the conflict and so on. But the one thing that we haven't really delved into, which I think we need to do in the future, is the impact that it's had on the Jewish community in the diaspora. And I mentioned this earlier this morning when we were talking, because not just with all segments of our Jewish community, and I'm particularly concerned about our next generation, our student populations, our young adult populations, who are experiencing a great deal of conflict and anti-Semitism, for that matter, but in high schools and colleges and in other areas of activity. And we need to think about how that's impacting upon all of us and our communities, and what it's doing maybe in terms of divisiveness within our communities, and how we can deal with that as well. I mean, there's very little that we can do with what's going on in Israel, on the ground in Israel, but I think there's a lot that we can do here in terms of approaching these issues in our own community.
Right. Thank you. Eric?
Well, this has been really nice to see everybody again from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I would just finish by saying that there is simply an untenable paradox between waging a war and providing humanitarian relief in the midst of that war. This is unheard of. Either you fight a war or you don't, and I think this war has been badly waged, and it does need to come to an end. And the only way that it can come to an end, that's a happy end, is precisely through what countries in the world have avoided until now, which is some kind of multinational force. In 1948 and in 1967, there was a real possibility of a multinational force in what that time was known as Palestine and then Israel. The Americans pulled out. They wouldn't even send 100 or 200 men in 1948 because, yes, they would get shot at and they would probably have to shoot people. The Americans wouldn't allow Soviet peacekeepers, or the term wasn't used at the time, but they wouldn't allow Soviet personnel. And so the whole idea failed. And if there had been that multinational force in 1948, things might have turned out very differently. And the same thing in 1967. And there was a call for an international shipping, like a convoy to try to break the blockade of the Straits of Iran. And that could have very easily caused Egypt to stand down. And there would not have been a 1967 war, but the Johnson administration chickened out. They wouldn't provide the ships, and no other country would. In other words, until and unless the international community steps up, this conflict is so entrenched and so intractable that it cannot and will not be solved. So I know that I'm asking for an impossibility, but you learned from the past what was necessary. And it's all the more necessary this time around.
Thank you. Dylan.
I mean, I think Derek wrapped it up really nicely. I guess all I'll say is, you know, the theme to me of all of the pushing and pulling we've done today comes down to leadership, and people making decisions and trying to be intentional, and the need to look long term, and, you know, not always push for what seems like it'll be immediately more pleasant, but that's going to lead to really long-term progress. And I think until we have that, it's going to be difficult. And I think that's true on the Israeli side. I think it's true on the Palestinian side. And I think it's true in the foreign policy of Western countries, especially the United States, that are sort of trying to do this, but in fits and starts and half measures.
Over to you, Rabbi Kay.
Thank you, David. So I just want to thank all of you, our wonderful panel, but also thank our attendees. We had almost 45 people in the attendee range today, which is a very exciting number and a wonderful start to our season. The Israel Dialogues will return after the Chagim. As many of you know, October is a very, very busy month. And we won't ask anyone to do anything more than just to focus on the business of Judaism for this remainder of Elul and into early Tishrei. So we look forward to seeing you again. And I will just mention that on Yom Kippur here at Holy Blossom, I'm pleased to announce that Ambassador Bob Ray will be our featured speaker during our learning in the afternoon. Ambassador Ray is the Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. He is a friend of the synagogue with roots here, and he will, I'm sure, have a candid and frank conversation with people from all sorts of different perspectives. So if you have questions for him, if you have concerns that you want to raise with him, Yom Kippur is a good day for truth-telling. Just remember that it's also important to hear what people have to say on our Day of Atonement as well. So I look forward to seeing you in the coming days as we get ready for the Chagim. We look forward to seeing you here on the Israel Dialogues when we return. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel.
Shabbat shalom.
Good Shabbos.
Well,